In section 3, we want to talk about leadership, how it relates to social psychology, in particular, how it relates to you all in the sport management industry. Section 3 really is about building skill sets, and these are going to be some of the things that you need to have in your arsenal as you move forward to be successful within the sport industry. This might include an in-depth understanding of leadership, really realizing the sources and types of power and how to negotiate those things. It's going to be really also about communication and group cohesion, impression management, really seeing how these things engage and interact on a day-to-day basis. And then we're going to wrap up the section by talking about some ideas of fear, security, anxiety, and safety. Let's talk about leadership development first. Leadership is something that you're not necessarily born with. We are going to treat it as a skill set. It's a skill set that can be learned, it can be built, it can be honed over time, just like really anything else. Right? You didn't learn to shoot a basketball. Maybe there was a predilection or you had some natural athletic ability, but you had to learn how to do it. You weren't necessarily born knowing how to do everything perfectly within a sport. And let's translate that idea to the sport organizational setting. The reason we want to invest in leadership and try to develop it, not only within each individual, but also within an organization, is that we see that when you invest in leadership, you're going to have higher satisfaction of athletes, employees, coaches, managers, and this is both in terms of their personal life and their professional productivity. Speaking of productivity, you're going to have, if you invest in leadership, you tend to have more organizational productivity impact. And then also one of the things that we notice, and all this stuff has been identified through years of empirical research, is that if you invest in leadership, then you tend to have a better engagement with the communities that you're going to be a part of. And that's going to be really important to you all as you work in the sport industry. What is leadership? We talk a lot about it, and I think it behooves us to just kind of pull back, take a step back, and let's define leadership. There are a lot of different ways of approaching leadership. I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but here are just some ideas to make sure that we have more or less the same notion of what constitutes leadership. Think of it as interpersonal influence exercised by a person or multiple people, right? Through the process of communication and through impact. And you're going to do this to attain an organization's goals. Now, what we do know is that you can have leadership so that you can help individuals lead, and that's going to be very, very important as well. At this point, we're talking a lot about how the individual engages within the organizational context. Okay? Leadership originally just kind of comes from the Greek verb, and I think what's interesting is if you look at kind of the translation of that, this Greek verb looks at action, beginning, achievement, and finishing something. And I think what's kind of nice about that is it really outlines a nice story arc. It's about beginning. It's about being involved. Leadership is not just words, it's also actions, and it's about achieving things. And so this ongoing activity is really going to involve not just influencing a person, but also potentially a group to some sort of, accomplishment of certain goals, right? And if you look within all of the research that's been done within sport management and leadership, here are a couple of key ideas that we've noted over the years. Very famous sport management research, Dr. Cheladurai, noted that evaluation is key to understanding if we want to accomplish our goals. And so just saying, hey, I have goals and this is how we're going to do it, achieving goals and leadership being able to support that process really is about evaluating where you are at each step in the process. Some additional sport management and leadership researchers notice, according to Lee, that control, right, which is really just part of monitoring defined goals, it's part of this larger process. And I think that's what all of these scholars are really talking about, is that if you're going to have a group or an organization being defined as successful, then leadership needs to be a part of all these different processes. It's not just something that is in a title. It's not just something that you do on Friday afternoons, right? Leadership is going to be built into every process within the organization. And it's also something that has to be cultivated, not just within the individual, but also within the organizational setting, which means you have to be displaying, appropriate, impactful, empathetic leadership all the time for it to really, really resonate with folks. We talked about the sport management, which is much more of a sport business or organizational setting, but there's also been a lot of work done for those of you that are interested in coach behavior. So looking at sport leadership from much more of a coach's point of view. So coach behavior is hypothesized to be influenced or determined by 3 sets of factors. Okay, this is going to be the individual differences, the situational factors, and the coach perceptions of athletes' attitudes. And I think all this is really important. And if you just kind of follow this graph, right? So the coach's behavior is going to influence the perception of the player, and the coach's behavior is going to influence how they see those individual athletes. Okay, the players are going to respond in a certain way to the coach's behavior, and that will then influence what the coach does next. And then the idea and the hope here is that if change is necessary, then when the cycle starts over again, that coach has adapted their behavior. What's really important to what Smolin and Smith were really talking about with this sport leadership model is that while it is simple and it involves an understanding of individuals and what's going on in this situation, and it's also going to involve how the coach is engaging with the athlete and how the athletes are engaging with the coaches. And so you have those individual perceptions. And so really what coaching is about is not just teaching individualistic aspects of a sport in terms of how to be athletically or team-oriented successful. It's really about engaging individuals and being able to adapt from one situation to the next. So I culled a lot of different coaching resources, and I have all these books, and I have all these a personal network with all these coaches, and I just kind of sit down and I ask them periodically, what in regard to leadership and being actively involved, what are some things that you're looking for, or what are some things that you have seen successful coaches do over the years? So here are a couple of the things that I've seen in my time. One is these coaches talk about establishing trust and credibility. And that's something that has to be done every single day. And I thought that was really important because, each day that you go to practice is you want to make sure that the athletes are trusting you and that you are legitimate. You have their best interests at heart. You also have the team's best interest at heart. And then you're going to have your other coach's best interest in your heart. That's really where trust and credibility are going to come from. Number 2 is talking about staying cool under pressure, and not just cool in terms of being able to make decisions, but also remaining calm, because oftentimes when things get very stressful, people look to the leader to calm those emotions and sometimes that individual or the collective anxiety. That's really what we're talking about here. Fairness, but also being very decisive with decisions, not being wishy-washy. And this is where, core values, a mission, a vision are really important because they should be guiding those decisions and they should be based upon fairness. So if those core values, for example, are really important on a day-to-day basis, then you should be able to make relatively quick decisions because you have the compass bearing. Those core values are influencing everything that you're going to be doing. The idea of positivity. Really making sure that an environment is based upon learning, and that especially when you start thinking about practice, because it's about teaching. It's about teaching, and teaching. And that doesn't mean you can't correct someone. It doesn't mean you can't identify that they need to do better. It doesn't mean that you can't get upset. But overall, you need to make sure that the team environment is positive, because one of the things that we find is that we talk about a toxic environment and a toxic team environment. That's going to inhibit productivity regardless of how talented the coaches or the athletes are on that particular team. Keep things simple and have realistic expectations. And I think this is really important because it's so simplistic that oftentimes we overlook it. And making sure that people know what they need to do every single day and what they need to do to get better. Follow a performance plan. Coaches that go out there and just kind of wing it, that don't necessarily have a goal attainment strategy or they don't have organized practices, the athletes are going to pick up on that. And they realize that, okay, this person did not necessarily provide the structure. They didn't take the time to provide the structure so that we as individuals and we as a team can go out and be successful today. And that disorganization is going to lead to eventually anxiety, and then you're going to lose buy-in from the entire group. And then providing some sort of support for the athletes. We see a lot more organizations involving social workers or counselors or psychologists, realizing as a coach that you are not necessary. Some are sports psychologists, but realizing that maybe someone needs some assistance, needs some help, being able to guide them to those resources that they need. The other thing I think is really important is that we want actionable outcomes, right? And oftentimes leadership is about being able to create action. And we know that words, we know that ideas, things that are sitting on a PowerPoint slide such as this are nice, but ultimately, when you're looking at whether you're looking at the team environment or the sport organizational environment, it's about turning these ideas into outcomes, into actions. One of the things that's really important to kind of moving leadership from just talking about it into actionable outcomes is realizing that power as a concept is important to everything that we do. So what is power? Well, I could be defined, and this is sort of a difficult definition because it sounds very negative. It's not necessarily meant to be, but power can be defined as influence others to do something they may not ordinarily have done. All right, so that means there are power dynamics that are at play in every situation, and power is going to be then important and central to leadership. And it's going to be central to leadership because, as Spider-Man's uncle once said, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And so being able to use power in a positive way and realizing that power is not just one thing. They're all different forms of power. And sometimes in certain situations, power is not going to be given to just one person. And I think that's a really, really important idea because it really sets the stage for understanding team dynamics, team concepts, and then working within a sport organizational framework. Again, there are a lot of different sources of power. I chose just one research study that looked at these different sources of power, and we're just going to walk through these very, very quickly. Legitimate power. This is where the power that you have in the organization really comes from your position. So maybe you're listed as the COO, or maybe you are the coach, or maybe you are the director of marketing. But whatever your position is, then you have this form of legitimate power. Reward power is this idea that you have the ability to provide valued rewards to other folks. Now, one of the things I hope that you're starting to see as we start talking about this is that you have multiple types and sources of power that are going to operate simultaneously, right? So a reward power might be able to, you might be able to give someone a raise. You have the ability to provide them that valued reward, such as a raise or maybe time off from practice. And sometimes that having reward power is associated with having that position in the organization, such as legitimate power. Example here is that maybe you're a head coach. If we're talking about the team setting, you're the head coach. And so you have legitimate power because of the title of being head coach. You also have the ability to reward folks and maybe, take a day off here, right? They've done some really good work. You see that their body's a little bit fatigued or exhausted, so you pull back today. You're able to do that. Coercive power is the exact sort of opposite, if you will, of reward power. It's ability to punish people. Expert power, your power is based upon the valued or in-demand expertise. And I find this one to be very, very interesting because expert power may not necessarily be associated with the legitimate power or the position. Case in point, if I have questions about technology, if something goes wrong with my computer and I need to reach out to someone for assistance, all of a sudden, even though maybe I have a pretty lofty title in my organization, for example, the power in that situation goes from me to that person in IT that is actually helping me because they have the expertise in regards to being able to assist me. Another great example of expert power is if you think about in the NFL and on the sidelines and neurologists that are independent of the team being able to weigh in on concussions. Again, the idea that someone has expertise, that's extremely important, and so we listen to them, and that's a modicum of power. Information power results from access to and oftentimes control over the distribution of information about things, whether that's organizational operation, future plans within the organization, whatever. Now, information power, again, might be distributed among a number of folks, but it's also another interesting way to kind of look at this concept of power. Referent power, personal characteristics that appeal to others. One of the very first ways that we looked at leadership and power was through this idea of charisma. If you go back through, and we'll talk a little bit about here in terms of trait theory, but that people are extremely charismatic, and as a result, they have the power or the ability to sway people's thoughts and actions. Okay, that's really what we're talking about here. So we have all this, we have a basic understanding of leadership, we have a basic understanding of power, and what we really want to do is kind of bring those things together. We know that power comes from all these different sources, right? And we know that leadership really is an essential resource for not just individual, but also organizational productivity and impact. And we want to examine how those things collide together. And so research strategies have really tried to understand the different types or the styles of leaderships. And this has really gone on for literally centuries, right? People have been trying to understand leadership and how it works and engages. And so what we want to do is just briefly and quickly walk through a basic understanding of leadership theories. The trait approach, this one's pretty simple. It states that there are certain basic inherent characteristics that are essential for effective leadership. Universal personal qualities include intelligence, pleasing appearance, and oftentimes self-confidence. Charisma could be associated with this as well. This was one of the earliest ways to try to understand leadership and its sort of appeal to folks. And recently it's made a comeback in the popularity with the measuring of more and more personality traits. Again, as in previous lectures and notes, please feel free to click on that and you can actually follow the Big 5 personality test and really see how the trait approach has manifested itself back into a modern day understanding of leadership. The behavior approach, again, is exactly what it sounds like. And it says basically that leadership is best explained by what people do, what those leaders do, not necessarily just the traits they possess. And so you can see from that date, 1938, that we've been thinking about and trying to engage with these ideas for decades and decades. But what Lewin and Lippitt really did was they identified 3 leader behaviors. You had the autocrat, the democrat, and then laissez-faire. Let's start with laissez-faire. And this is really kind of comes from the idea of a hands-off policy. So it's a French word or phrase really talking about you sort of let folks do what they do. Okay, you're not actively involved. Okay, the democratic approach tends to favor more of a group decision-making process. Now, let's be honest here, the more folks that you get involved in a decision, the less efficient it becomes. Okay, and that's kind of a difference here, is that as more folks weigh in on a decision, you have probably a better chance of coming to an appropriate decision because you have more ideas, more ways to think about it, more viewpoints, but it does take time. It's not necessarily an efficient way of looking at things. The autocratic leadership behavior tends to be pretty efficient because it's usually one person or a very, very, very small group that makes decisions for everyone. They tend to supervise individuals very closely. They tend to be very authoritarian in terms of kind of making unilateral, heavy-handed decisions. What they say goes, as it were. Research has showed that leadership behavior was described by a leader's orientation, an orientation to whether they were more focused on the task or whether they were more focused on building the relationship. All right, so the task-oriented person is going to, the productivity and completing whatever that project or task is, setting up for an event, for example, that's task orientation. Relationship orientated folks are going to be those that focus on the personal relationships, the human dynamics, and how those things are going to interact. It doesn't mean that they're not focused on a task. It just means that they tend to prioritize organizational culture and the people over the completion of the task. Again, not saying one is better and worse than the other, because if we're being honest, these are going to be orientations that provide a more successful viewpoint in certain situations. Here's kind of an example of what we were just talking about, the behavior approach. It's sort of taken an extension of it. So you really want to measure the type of leadership, and especially that leadership behavior. And what Blake and Mouton did was they really just charted out everything. And they wanted to look at the results of whether people were going to be involved in the task or whether they were going to be involved more with the people. Okay, now keep it in mind, we both know that you're going to need to connect with both of these ideas. And that's kind of what they really thought about here, was that it's not necessarily an is or ain't thing. You're not just task-oriented or relationship-oriented. You're probably going to be an intermingling of the two. And what they tried to do here was just kind of chart out so that people could really understand and learn their leadership and management style. The situational approach is really focused on the situation or the external factors, and it really claims that effective leadership is going to be impacted by both the leader's traits and the environment or the situation. So that means effective leadership is going to vary between situations. And this is going to be known as contingency theory. And I think that's really important, because what situational approach is saying is that based upon the situation and how you act and react and engage and what are your personal dispositions, you have to be flexible. So this is when we talk about leaders need to be adaptable and flexible. This is kind of what they're talking about. The person's style, that's going to be, I think, really interesting, because the leader's personal style and the amount of control that the leader has over the situation, this is going to really influence how things are going to get done. So if a leader's style refers to whether they focus on completing the task or building the relationships, and we already know that from the previous example, but the control of this situation, I think this is kind of a new interesting variable, because it's really based upon whether the tasks, the jobs that need to be completed are really clear. Does the leader have multiple forms or sources of power? And the leader, do they have a good relationship with the people in the organization? You know, if you're talking about something being clear, think about the recent passing of a name, image, and likeness, or the sort of the deregulation of it in the NCAA. And this is going to be something that's been really interesting to see, not just recently in the past, but also moving forward, is that how much control over that situation of NIL does the athletic department or the athletic director, or do individuals have, right? As policies change based on institution or state, you're then going to see that you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with something like that. And that's really what situational approaches is talking about. A little bit more recently in terms of kind of the story arc of understanding leadership, as we have kind of the path goal theory, which is really a very popular situational approach. And it's going to emphasize the needs or the goals of the followers, right? The follower is on some sort of path to achieving a goal, and the leader provides guidance, coaching, support, and really try to invest in the individual so that they can reach the goals. There are two basic situational factors that enhance the path goal of each participant or follower, right? That that person's characteristics, whether it's an employee or an athlete, right? This is going to be their skill level, their abilities, even things down to their personal traits in terms of their perceptions of work ethic, so on and so forth, right? So the participant characteristics. But then you also have the environmental characteristics. So this is going to be what needs to be accomplished. You know, is this a particular project that needs to be accomplished in a certain time? It's also going to talk about the team or the group. What's that culture like? What's that productivity level like for that organization? Okay? There are 4 leader behaviors that are then going to impact this whole idea of the path and the goal and the relationship for those participants, right? Is the leader directive, supportive, participative, or are they focused on achievement? Now, all of these different things, as they work together, that's going to interact with the participants' characteristics and the overall environment. And what this is really, again, showing is that the leader that's kind of directing the path and the goal for the participants or the athletes or the employees, the followers, however you want to conceptualize it in your mind, they really have to take these things into consideration and then decide how they're going to support. Are they going to be more democratic in terms of how much information do they take in from other people? Do you have a player on the team that provides, hey, this is what I'm seeing on the field, coach, you know, that kind of thing? They also need to make sure that they set the goals and that they keep people on. I mean, if you look at the name path goal, right, you have the goal that has to be set, and they're going to help keep people on that path. So it's really talking about the interaction of these things. The reciprocal approach, as you can probably see from all of these basic theories, they're not terribly creative in what they're called in terms of their names, and that's a good thing because this approach is talking about reciprocity, and it focuses on that sort of relational nature, the engagement piece, if you will, of the leader and the participant, and it's going to emphasize the mutual goals and motivations of the coach and the athlete, of the employer and the employee, and that's something that's really important. Okay, it's going to elevate the importance of the roles of the followers in the leadership process, and it's really characterized by these 2 dominant approaches: transactional and transformational. You've probably heard, throughout your college career, especially about transformational leadership, and this is something that's been heavily studied within the world of sport management, especially within coaches and intercollegiate athletic departments and things like that. Okay, but the transactional leader is going to try to motivate the athlete or the employee by helping them identify their goals, help build up their confidence, and show how that person, how their individual needs are really going to be tied to the goal achievement for maybe something larger. Okay, and this is really focusing on that individual, right? As a coach, I can help you become the best player possible. And this is how practice relates to your performance in the game. And if you go out if we're talking about football or some sport like that, if you're a great running back and you're extremely productive, that can also benefit me as a running backs coach. Okay? So it's transactional, and it's high engagement. It's focused on productivity and really about building the confidence of the individual. Transformation is a little bit different. So it focuses on not necessarily just the individual, but on the larger goals of the team or the organization. And it's really talking about how those larger goals are going to transcend the personal reward. The goal is to blend individual and team goals. This is wonderful in theory and difficult to do. Example, if we're talking about this sort of traditional athletic setting, how do you have a player and you have to get them to see as the head coach that what's best for the team is for them to play less and come off the bench? How do you get that individual athlete to see that their engagement with the team, the best way that they can support the team is to actually take less of a role or less prominent of a role as an individual? So it really kind of elevates the overall organizational approach. What I just tried to do here on this slide, and we're not necessarily going to go through this table blow by blow or anything like that, but it's just taking all those different approaches to understanding leadership, kind of shows you when they grew up, what are some examples, and then some basic major points. When we think about leadership, leadership is always changing. Leadership best practices have changed dramatically in the last just 5 years. The discussion of leadership has evolved. We're now talking about empathy much more. We're talking about emotional intelligence and how communication is part of all those different things. So these theories sort of represent the historical foundation for understanding leadership. And moving forward, what I encourage you to do is keep learning about leadership. Keep thinking about how you can grow as a person, as a leader, and how you can demonstrate leadership regardless of your position within that organization, because that's kind of where we are moving now with the newest trajectory of understanding leadership theories within both the sport industry, but then also the sport organizational setting.